Today, we're diving into a pretty hefty read, the classic masterpiece, Crime and Punishment, by the Russian writer Fyodor Dostoevsky. Yep, it's a heavy hitter, dubbed the ceiling of human literature and hailed as one of the unscalable peaks of Russian literature. So, what's this book all about? It's like a peek into the mind of a murderer. It's intense, I tell you. Dostoevsky slices open humanity and lays it bare for you to see, amidst all the bloody scenes, showing you both the darkness and the light. Now, the protagonist here is Raskolnikov. Russian literature loves its tongue twisters, but don't sweat it. Just think of it as a note, like A or B, and you'll be golden. This Raskolnikov is a law student, but due to his family's poverty, he had to drop out and rely on the support of his mother and sister to make ends meet. He lives alone in the city, struggling with overdue rent, often lying in the cramped confines of his rented room, almost cut off from the world. In this desperate situation, he conceived a theory of worth. He divides human society into two kinds of people, ordinary folks and extraordinary individuals. According to him, extraordinary people, like Caesar or Napoleon, can remove necessary obstacles for the sake of loftier goals. So, ordinary folks could break through a certain boundary and become extraordinary by doing so. Raskolnikov found this theory pretty convincing. Naturally, he wasn't content with being just another regular guy. He believed he belonged in the ranks of great men. But how could he prove his theory and make it real? Raskolnikov came up with a heroic dream, in quotes. He decided to do something, murder. But who to kill? He settled on the perfect candidate, an old woman who was a loan shark. She was always harsh and mean to the poor, and she made his life miserable too. He was determined to kill this old woman, to use her wealth to launch his own career and help more good people in need. He firmly believed that by doing so, he was serving justice and any future good deeds would outweigh the sin he was committing now. So one day, he stole an axe, pretended to pawn it, and used it to murder the old woman, taking her money bag. But just as Raskolnikov was about to leave, by a stroke of bad luck, the old woman's sister returned. Startled, Raskolnikov didn't wait for her to make a sound before he killed her too. After committing the murders, he was consumed by deep fear. Suddenly, he realized that killing didn't make him feel justified or heroic, like a great man at all. He underestimated what crime truly means and the depths of human nature. Throughout the story, Dostoevsky, with his keen insight into humanity, meticulously crafts the inner worlds of each character. The backdrop is vast, depicting the suffering of the Russian underclass in the 19th century, the rundown dwellings, the poverty of students, the corruption of officials, the vanity of women, and the vulnerability of girls forced into degradation. Amidst these struggles, love and light still shine, battling against life's contradictions and whirlpools. Now, you might not know much about Dostoevsky. Let's fill you in. He's a giant of Russian literature, right up there with Tolstoy, known as the two peaks of Russian literature. Previously, we discussed Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, and you might be somewhat familiar with the novel's depth and his narrative style. Well, Dostoevsky's works are equally weighty and influential, impacting famous writers like Kafka, Camus, Borges, Woolf, Maugham, Lu Xun, and Yu Hua, to name a few. In their eyes, Dostoevsky is a great master in literature. His works include Notes from Underground, Crime and Punishment, The Idiot, Demons, and The Brothers Karamazov, among others. Even if you've never heard of him before, Everyone should read at least one of his works in their lifetime. For me, my first Dostoevsky was The Idiot, then Crime and Punishment. And let me tell you, mustering the courage to finish his last masterpiece, The Brothers Karamazov, was quite the task. It's profound, but every read leaves you feeling heavy, like you can't catch your breath. It's hard to fathom how a writer like him could create such painful yet profound works. I once said, Dostoevsky is like a bleeding elephant lumbering forward, clumsy, astonishing, with an unparalleled sense of power. As we grow older and understand others more deeply, we come to appreciate Dostoevsky's brilliance even more. Amidst much suffering, Dostoevsky stands out. He portrays the harsh reality of life, acknowledging that cruelty often embraces suffering. The psychological intensity and depth he conveys might be hard for many to accept, yet they're enough to encourage us to face life openly, even in pain. Let me briefly introduce Dostoevsky. On November 11th, 1821, Fyodor Dostoevsky was born in the poorest corner of Moscow. His father was a nobleman and a surgeon. His father's hospital was located in a charitable area dedicated to helping the poor. Consequently, this area was quite bleak, with a large cemetery nearby. Dostoevsky's health was fragile from a young age. He developed epilepsy at the age of 9, which stayed with him throughout his life, giving him a unique perspective and experience of life. Interestingly, some great writers, like Proust with asthma and Nietzsche with mental illness, have had their literary sensibilities intertwined with their ailments. For them, illness serves as a tool for perception, allowing them to deeply scrutinize the world from a pathological mental dome. At 22, Dostoevsky graduated from a military engineering school in St. Petersburg and briefly worked as a junior civil servant before quitting to focus on writing. At 24, he penned the novel Poor Folk, earning overnight fame, though his poverty persisted. At 28, for participating in a secret anti-Tsarist gathering, he was sentenced to death, a meticulously orchestrated plan by Tsar Nicholas I, who knew the writer and intended to psychologically crush him before the execution. However, just minutes before the execution, the sentence was commuted to exile, a hair-raising moment indeed. Dostoevsky nearly faced death, but he saw it as an experience. He famously said, "Life is like a grain of wheat falling into the ground. It does not die. Man is a grain of wheat. Once dead, it will bring forth more fruit." This perspective changed many lives, inspiring literary critic Wang Doi to write a biography about Eileen Chong titled The Fallen Wheat Never Dies, derived from Dostoevsky's words. After surviving the brink of execution, Dostoevsky was exiled to Siberia, enduring 4 years of hard labor followed by 6 years of military service, 10 grueling years. At 38, he returned to St. Petersburg, resuming his literary career. He produced many works but also fell deep into gambling, drowning in debts and fleeing to Europe to escape creditors. Sadly, his newborn daughter passed away, leading Dostoevsky to admit in a letter to a friend, "My nature is too fervent. In every situation, in everything, I go to extremes. I've constantly overstepped boundaries throughout my life." Crime and Punishment, completed at 45, tells a tale of crossing boundaries. At that time, Russia had just abolished serfdom, facing societal upheaval, with disorder reigning in St. Petersburg. Dostoevsky resolved to reshape the spirit of his country and its people through his subsequent works, a powerful mission indeed. During the writing of Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky battled illness and poverty, resorting to writing letters to newspaper editors for advances on his fees, saying, "My life is in extreme poverty. Debt collectors constantly pressure me, even threatening to send me to prison." Despite these challenges, he persisted and crafted Crime and Punishment, hailed as a masterpiece. Why? Firstly, during that era, writing from the perspective of a murderer, in the first-person point of view, throughout the entire narrative was unprecedented, a creative breakthrough by Dostoevsky. Secondly, Dostoevsky's masterful portrayal of the human psyche, depicting the murderer's torment before and after the act, evokes intense imagery and empathy, shaking readers to their core. Most importantly, Dostoevsky was incredibly brave, unflinchingly tackling profound questions. Crime and Punishment confronts a fundamental dilemma. When one finds themselves in the mire, torn between desires and morals, where should the line be drawn? Is there something inviolable, even unto death? For instance, the protagonist Raskolnikov, driven by his theory of greatness and his desire to emulate moral righteousness, sets his own standards, envisions a brighter future, and commits murder. But does this liberate him? Far from it. Let's start from the beginning of the book. On an exceptionally hot evening early in July, a young man came out of the garret in which he lodged in S. Place and walked slowly, as though in hesitation, towards K. Bridge. This marks the opening of Crime and Punishment. The hesitant young man is our protagonist, Raskolnikov. He doesn't need to go far, not even beyond knowing the exact number of steps from his building's gate, exactly 730 steps. That's the extent of his life's reach, his predicament. Raskolnikov, a poor college student, possesses striking, dark eyes, deep brown hair, and an average build. He resides in a tiny garret atop a tall 5-story building in St. Petersburg. His dwelling resembles more of a cupboard than a place fit for habitation. Unable to afford tuition, he drops out of college. His landlady constantly demands rent, pushing him to his limits, bemoaning the unfairness of life. Every time he passes by the landlady's kitchen door, he's on edge, fearing to meet the creditor, hurriedly slipping downstairs if he does. At this moment, this handsome young man, weak from 2 days of near starvation, slowly, hesitantly walks the streets. He's on his way to pawn an old silver watch, a memento from his deceased father. A month ago, he pawned a gold ring his sister gifted him. To repay debts, he must pawn this watch again at the usurious old woman's place. She's a shriveled, mean old crone, her gaze sharp and vicious, her thin neck resembling a hen's foot wrapped in a tattered flannel scarf, and she wears no kerchief over her hair. Raskolnikov intends to pawn his watch for 4 rubles, but the old woman insists on 1.5 rubles, deducting 35 kopecks as advance interest. The old woman's shrewdness leaves Raskolnikov, the college student, feeling powerless and disgusted. Exiting the old woman's place, he dizzily wanders into a tavern. A man in his 50s, Marmeladov, engages him in conversation. Formerly a 9th-grade civil servant, Marmeladov is now jobless, supporting a family of 6, solely reliant on his former wife's daughter, Sonia, who turns to prostitution to make ends meet. 5 days ago, Marmeladov stole money from home to drink, selling his clothes too, now afraid to return. Raskolnikov eventually escorts the inebriated Marmeladov home, discovering their dwelling is a mere hallway. His wife, Katerina, afflicted with lung disease and hot-tempered, explodes in anger upon seeing her husband return. He went drinking with the money earned from his former wife's daughter's prostitution, neglecting the family's needs. She violently attacks him, while their 3 children suffer from hunger. Seeing this pitiful scene, Raskolnikov silently places the money from the watch he pawned on their windowsill and leaves. Even at this moment, Raskolnikov's compassion prevails. Returning to his coffin-like room, Raskolnikov tosses and turns throughout the night. The next morning, he receives a letter from his mother. She and his sister reside in another province, living off a yearly allowance of 120 rubles. His mother, aware of her son's inability to pay tuition and saddened, doesn't know what to do. In the letter, she mentions an important matter. His sister Dunya, previously employed as a governess, resigned after being harassed by the landlord. What to do? His sister has decided to get engaged to a man named Lizin, over 45 years old, stingy and hypocritical, with no deep love between them. Her willingness to marry such a man stems solely from her desire to help her brother, as he can financially support his education. It's not an ideal match, but their mother, considering her son's situation, approves. Thus, in the letter, she says, "Your sister loves you more than herself. She's an angel." She adds, "As long as you're happy, we'll be happy too." It's genuine affection. But this made Raskolnikov extremely distressed. Because this was a love he couldn't bear, he didn't want to accept his mother's favoritism and his sister's sacrifice. He resolved, "As long as I am alive, I cannot let this marriage succeed." But how could he escape his current situation? Raskolnikov wandered aimlessly out the door, and there, on a shady path, he saw a drunken woman. She was Sonia. Remember her? That girl who was forced into prostitution for her family's sake. She was about 16, with a small, pretty face and light yellow hair. A stout, red-faced man was closely pursuing her. Raskolnikov felt great sympathy for this girl who was being humiliated, so he stepped forward to protect her and got into an argument with the man. Looking at Sonia, he thought of his own sister. He was surrounded by souls in miserable circumstances, trapped in poverty. The book says, to live, to live, to live. Whatever happens, just to live is so right, yet people are despicable. Whoever calls a person despicable because of this, he too is despicable. Sometimes people are compelled by life, feeling unable to change, unable to endure. Where is the way out? In a small tavern, Raskolnikov overheard an argument between a soldier and a college student. The student said, "It's so bad for this old woman who lends money at high interest everywhere. She's of no use to society. If we were to kill this old woman, take her money to help the suffering young people, the benefits of this would clearly outweigh the negatives." On the path to achieving great deeds, it's unnecessary to care about trivial matters like stepping on a blade of grass or killing an ant. Just by paying the price of doing a little wrong, one could do thousands of good deeds. Wasn't this what Raskolnikov had thought about before? The debate between the two of them at that moment stirred his heart deeply. He remembered what happened when he went to pawn something yesterday. In fact, he went to the old woman not just for that, but also to scout. He did think about taking justice into his own hands, about killing the old woman. Can you see the contradiction emerging here? On one hand, Raskolnikov is indeed a compassionate, kind person. He would help a girl scorned by others. He even gave his last money to families in distress. But on the other hand, the evil in his heart is also very active. He idolizes warrior Napoleon, believing that to achieve great things, to become a hero, sacrificing some insignificant vermin is irrelevant. Because history can only be written by the victors, who would care about the dirty deeds of those who succeed. He wants to become a great hero who changes the world, an extraordinary person who can overcome inequality barriers. If he could kill the old woman who lends money at high interest, it would be his first step towards becoming the benefactor of all mankind. These are the mad thoughts in Raskolnikov's mind at the moment. Dostoevsky recorded all this mercilessly, without judgment. After returning home, Raskolnikov fell into a deep sleep again. It wasn't until 6 o'clock the next afternoon that he woke up. He had already planned 2 weeks ago to use an axe for the murder, so he stole one from the landlord. To avoid suspicion, he even invented a loop to hang the axe. He thought to himself, carrying an axe openly on the street was out of the question. If he hid the axe under his coat, he would have to hold it with his hand, which would be noticeable. Now, with a loop, he could hang the axe securely inside axe handle to prevent it from swinging. Because the coat was so wide, like a pocket, nothing could be seen from the outside. This way, he thought it all through. It wasn't a sudden impulse. So he set off for the old woman's house, and all along the way, luck was on his side, and he smoothly arrived at the old woman's doorstep. Under the pretext of pawning something, Raskolnikov entered the old woman's house, and then he used the axe to kill her. He went to the bedroom to search for money. He took an old lady's purse and a few pawned jewelry items. Just as he was about to leave, the old lady's sister, Lizaveta, returned. She was shocked by the scene before her. In his panic, Raskolnikov killed the old lady's sister as well. Yet none of this was discovered on the spot. He returned to his lodging in a state of shock. He had killed 2 people, but had not been caught. Would he escape punishment? Moving forward, Raskolnikov's first thought was to get rid of this matter quickly. Murder had placed an enormous psychological burden on him. It painfully dawned on him that he couldn't become an extraordinary person like Napoleon. His conscience tortured him deeply. How could he rid himself of this heavy burden of guilt? This was his first crime, and he was mentally tense, fearing any slip-ups. He lay in bed, trembling. At this moment, he received a summons from the police station. Raskolnikov thought his crime had been discovered and prepared to go to the station, to kneel down and confess everything. However, when he arrived at the police station the next day, he found that the summons was not about the murder. It was from the landlady, accusing him of unpaid debts. He changed his mind, breathed a sigh of relief. Then he talked to the police, describing how the landlady had treated him well, and even promised to marry her beautiful daughter to him, but then this didn't happen, and so on. At this point, he overheard the police chief and deputy chief discussing a murder case, where the old woman who lent money at high interest had been killed. The scene at the crime scene. Raskolnikov couldn't bear the psychological pressure anymore and fainted. He almost spilled the beans. After returning from the police station, Raskolnikov remembered the ill-gotten gains he had brought back yesterday were still in his rented room, which would expose him. So he thought about throwing these stolen items into the canal, but there were too many people by the riverbank, so he didn't dare. Later, he saw a deserted yard piled with materials. He buried the purse and other items under a large stone. Throughout, Raskolnikov never counted how much money was in the purse. Then he began to doubt why he had committed murder. Wasn't it for money? If all this was conscious, not just a momentary lapse, if you truly had a clear and unwavering purpose, why hadn't you even looked at the purse until now? Why didn't you know how much money you got, what you were enduring this pain for, why you consciously did such despicable, ugly, and lowly things? Isn't it so? He asked himself, why did you want to immediately throw the purse into the water without even looking at what it contained? This was repeated self-interrogation. Raskolnikov finally realized that behind all the noble rhetoric, behind a complete logic, was his own desire. He didn't murder for money, nor to become a benefactor of the world. He did it to display a kind of courage. What kind of courage? Because I'm not living well now, so I want to change. This change is to despise the existing system, to step over the principles you've set, and then I want to gain power to control myself, including controlling the fate of others. Should that old lady be killed just because she's greedy and selfish? It was at this moment that Raskolnikov began to repeatedly ponder these questions. Facing the magnificent palace by the Neva River, although he had been there dozens of times before, this time, he strongly felt that everything had disappeared from his eyes, and he could never return to the past world and the past self. The book says, it was as if with scissors, he had cut himself off from all people and all things. What did these scissors mean? Raskolnikov lost his normal state. He slept for 3 days and 3 nights. During this time, one of his college classmates, Razumikin, took care of him and also called a doctor for Raskolnikov. One evening, at Razumikin's house, the guests again discussed the murder case that had occurred. This made Raskolnikov very nervous. But surprisingly, he received news that the killer had been caught. Who was it? A painter. He was only 22 years old, named Mikolka. On the day of the incident, the painter was painting the room on the second floor of the building, very close to the fourth floor crime scene. Later, when he was caught at a tavern with a ring of the murdered old woman, now the painter has been arrested. While they were discussing the case, a stranger visited. It was Luzin, the fiancé of Raskolnikov's sister. He came to see Raskolnikov. Through the conversation with Luzin, Raskolnikov became even more convinced that his sister's fiancé was a complete hypocrite. He rudely dismissed Luzin and refused all the gifts and promises he offered. After everyone left, around 8 p.m., Raskolnikov went back out onto the street. An incomprehensible, irresistible impulse drove him back to the scene of the old lady's residence, the crime scene. He found the house under renovation, and 2 workers were puzzled by his arrival. Raskolnikov ignored their questions and went straight to the door. He grabbed the doorbell and rang it, the same bell, the same tinny sound. He rang it a second and third time, listening and remembering more vividly the horrible, painful, and terrifying feeling of killing. With each ring, he trembled. Yet, at the same time, he felt increasingly pleased. Why? Because at that moment, he had made up his mind to go to the police station and end everything. He knew that only by doing so could he be completely liberated. But he was obstructed by something as he walked out. On the main street, he saw a carriage hit a drunkard crossing the road, and everyone was watching. Raskolnikov approached and recognized the injured man. It was Marmeladov, whom he had met in the tavern a few days earlier. The accident was serious. His entire chest was crushed, and he might die before reaching the hospital. So Raskolnikov volunteered to take him home, wanting to help. Marmeladov, on the brink of death, was brought home, and their family, including Sonia, who had been called back from the street by her sister, all gathered. Raskolnikov saw Sonia, dressed as a prostitute for the first time, and couldn't believe how such a pure soul could be forced into such a life. He watched Marmeladov die in Sonia's arms, then gave the little money he had, only 20 rubles, to help with their funeral arrangements. That was the living expenses his mother had sent him this morning, and then he quietly left, feeling feverish, but unaware. His heart was filled with an inexplicable feeling he had never experienced before, as if an infinitely powerful vitality suddenly surged within him, overwhelming his heart, much like the feeling of unexpected reprieve for a condemned man. This line is about what? It's about Dostoevsky's real-life experience. Why is it brought in here? He wrote in the book that after the crime, Raskolnikov was constantly self-doubting, becoming increasingly depressed. But when he helped the dying Marmeladov and his family with his last bit of money, Raskolnikov gained a positive feeling about himself, that he hadn't collapsed, he was still alive, and he still had the ability to be an extraordinary person. But his guilt hadn't disappeared. Returning to his rented room, it was already late at night. Raskolnikov found someone waiting for him. His mother and sister had been waiting for him for an hour and a half. They had just arrived in St. Petersburg, immediately coming to see him, after 3 years of not seeing each other. Raskolnikov felt an unbearable feeling of a lightning bolt striking him. He collapsed to the ground, unconscious. When he woke up, he regained his love and sense of responsibility. He directly expressed his opinion on his sister's engagement. It was not acceptable. With him, there would be no Luzin, and with Luzin, there would be no him. Then, in a face-to-face meeting with the family, Luzin's true colors were exposed. His mother and sister broke off ties with Luzin on the spot. What would happen to this family next? A man named Svidrigailov appeared, a man with a bad reputation, Dunya's former employer. He once expressed his love to Dunya, Raskolnikov's sister, but she rejected him. Despite her refusal, he persisted and tried to tarnish Dunya's reputation. Then, as soon as Dunya arrived in Petersburg, this landowner pursued her, still hoping to win her affection by offering her 10,000 rubles. Intending to drive a wedge between Dunya and Luzin and have her choose him instead. Why was this landowner so persistent? Because he too had his own sins. He had caused the death of his wife and ever since had been haunted by fear of ghosts and plagued by nightmares. He desperately sought Dunya's love, believing that it could cleanse him, offering him spiritual liberation and redemption. It's another case of sin and punishment, but Raskolnikov coldly rejected him. Later that night, Raskolnikov went to Sonia's lodging. He believed that Sonia, forced into prostitution, had only 3 paths ahead: suicide by drowning, admission to a mental asylum, or resignation to her fate. What did Sonia think? She rejected the first option herself, reasoning that if she died, what would become of her family? She had a stepmother and 3 half-siblings. Despite no blood relation, they were still her family. Sonia didn't prioritize her own fate. She felt responsible for her stepmother and siblings and feared that her 2 little sisters might follow in her footsteps. Did Sonia resign herself to degradation? Not exactly. Despite her body being tainted, Sonia maintained spiritual purity and moral freedom. She devoutly believed in God, her soul constantly yearning for miracles. The miracle she hoped for wasn't just about someone entering her life to lift her family out of poverty, like a savior. What did Sonia anticipate? She considered herself fallen, transgressing norms, yet she believed she could still earn God's love and return to his embrace. Sonia said, "Without God, what would I be?" Perhaps this is her being stuck in the mud, mired in sin, but without insanity at its root. She couldn't not believe in God or in the immortality of the soul. Otherwise, she'd just be a fallen girl in this world. It's because of her belief in eternal life that she could endure all the hardships of her dark reality. Raskolnikov suddenly discovered the source of Sonia's strength and was deeply moved. He quickly knelt down and kissed Sonia's feet, startling her. Raskolnikov said, "I'm not worshipping you. I'm kneeling to all human suffering." Yes, it was within suffering that Sonia's purity still touched him. Meanwhile, the investigation into the murder of the old woman continued. Raskolnikov was heavily suspected. Firstly, he fainted at the police station upon hearing about the case, an extreme reaction that drew attention. Secondly, a long list of suspects was compiled, and everyone else on the list had voluntarily gone to the police station for questioning, but Raskolnikov was the last to arrive after hearing rumors. Thirdly, he had visited the crime scene alone, a highly suspicious move. Lastly, Raskolnikov was a law student and had published an article titled On Crime in a magazine analyzing the psychology of criminals in depth, indicating strong anti-detection abilities. Putting all this together, examining magistrate Porfiry Petrovich had serious doubts about Raskolnikov. They engaged in a cat-and-mouse game, with Porfiry exploiting Raskolnikov's suspicious nature, encouraging him to speculate about the intentions of the police and investigators, and deliberately making ambiguous remarks to unsettle Raskolnikov's conscience and caution. But an unexpected turn ended their standoff. Just as the case was about to be resolved, someone stepped forward and confessed voluntarily. Who is it? A member of a sect who believed suffering was the path to redemption. So, this person came forward and said, "I killed the old woman." Is it really him? Not quite, but he believes that people should endure suffering to achieve redemption, even if he didn't actually commit a crime. However, now that this person has suddenly confessed, Raskolnikov can escape legal punishment. But for Raskolnikov at this moment, is everything really over? No, not at all. The conversation with Sonia earlier brought him a powerful mental shock, igniting the conflicts within Raskolnikov's heart. The book says, a person with a conscience, once recognizing their mistake, will feel deep pain. This is also a form of punishment for him, a punishment beyond hard labor. You see, at this point, the definition of crime and punishment extends beyond modern legal systems. It's the constant torment of conscience, including the so-called will of God. With the constant torture, Raskolnikov finds it truly unbearable. He didn't confess to his mother or sister, nor did he confess to the detective. He chose to spill everything to Sonia, admitting that he had killed someone. In Sonia's rented room, Raskolnikov confessed his motive for the murder. He said, "I wanted to be Napoleon, so I killed. I've just killed a vermin, a useless, loathsome, harmful vermin. Whose mind and spirit are strong, they are the rulers. Those who dare greatly, they are right in their eyes. The more they scorn, the more they legislate. The bolder, the more correct. It has always been this way, and it will always be." Power is only given to those who dare to stoop and pick it up. I dared to try. So I killed. Yes, these were all the seemingly unassailable logic Raskolnikov clung to before. But now, as he speaks these words, he's in immense pain. Once again, he turns to Sonia and asks, should one stand by and watch as the wicked thrive and the good suffer? Or should one kill the wicked to save the good? And what is truly right when it comes to one's own crimes? Raskolnikov lamented in despair that it was himself he killed, not the old woman. He has thus ruined himself at once. Ruined forever. Yes, no matter how much reasoning he had thought before. But at this moment, there was no way for him to justify his crime with any peace of mind. There was blood on his hands, and there was no way for him to cross the boundaries and become Napoleon. There was no way for him to go back to the past, to the weakness and vulgarity he had once despised, and he didn't know how to face the future. Sonia had no way of understanding his motives, but Sonia thought Raskolnikov was a kind man. They had sort of met in passing, but this college student had been generous to himself and his family. Raskolnikov did kill someone, but Sonia could feel his misfortune and urged him to turn himself in and atone for his sins and suffer. Their secretive conversation was overheard by the tenant next door. And who is this nosy neighbor? It was none other than the landlord, the same one who had proposed to Raskolnikov's sister, Dunya. With this newfound leverage, he took the chance to write Dunya a letter, summoning her for a private meeting. Despite the risks for her brother's sake, Dunya ventured forth, undaunted by the landlord's verbal threats. When he dared to push further, Dunya, with her trusty revolver in hand, stood her ground, expressing her defiance. In the end, the landlord relented and released Dunya. His torment remained, his sins unabsolved, accepting his fate. What fate awaited him thereafter? We'll get to that shortly. But first, let's talk about Raskolnikov. After much deliberation, he heeded Sonia's counsel and decided to confess. He aimed to uphold the supreme good Sonia believed in. In that moment, it felt as if clarity returned to the world, dispelling the city's gloom. With firm strides, Raskolnikov walked the streets, dropping to his knees at a crossroad to kiss the earth. Onlookers watched in astonishment, murmuring amongst themselves, too awestruck to disturb him. They mistook him for a saint, yet his journey of self-redemption was just beginning. Raskolnikov placed himself on equal footing with everyone, irrespective of intellect or status. It was a humble, genuine equality, the equality of life itself. He and the old pawnbroker were equals. In this moment, Raskolnikov deeply repented, prostrating himself on the ground, kissing the earth beneath his feet amidst the bustling city square. In the novel's conclusion, Sonia's stepmother passed away, and the 3 children received assistance from the landlord. Yes, the landlord generously offered financial aid, enabling the children to enter an orphanage. After completing this deed, the landlord took his own life. Meanwhile, Raskolnikov's sister, Dunya, married Razumikin, the only sweet couple in the book radiating brightness and love. Raskolnikov voluntarily turned himself in and was ultimately sentenced to 8 years of hard labor. Sonia willingly accompanied him to the cold Siberian wilderness. She shuttled between the prison and the town, conveying Raskolnikov's condition to his family and friends while updating him on theirs. She undertook simple odd jobs, occasionally helping prisoners write letters and purchasing medicine to sustain herself. She never attempted to console Raskolnikov, deeply entrenched in his negativity, merely visiting him regularly. Once, when Sonia fell ill and couldn't visit, Raskolnikov was consumed by anxiety. He suddenly realized he was no longer alone. Despite his suffering and exile, he had another person in his heart, Sonia. Only in her presence did he experience that rich inner peace. This seemed to spark a change within Raskolnikov's once barren soul. When Sonia appeared beside him, Raskolnikov watched her, quietly approaching and sitting beside her. It was still early, the chill of dawn lingering. Sonia wore a shabby, hooded cloak and a green scarf, her face pale and thin, yet she smiled faintly at Raskolnikov. Timidly, as usual, she extended her hand towards him, a touching gesture. Suffering, nurtured by these gentle details deep within the soul, softened a person, instilling a glimmer of belief. All roughness and hostility, honed repeatedly, eventually dissipated, giving way to something new and precious, genuine emotion. How did this all come to pass? Raskolnikov himself couldn't say.